Welcome, everyone. We are here at Word Vancouver, and I would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. My name is Angela Crocker. I will be your moderator today, and I'm just thrilled to be working with Alison Tedford Seaweed, who I'll introduce in a moment. My background is as a digital living educator. I'm the author of 7 books about how we live and work with technology, so it's very appropriate that we are live streaming this session as well as being IRL in real life together. So thank you to everyone who's here in the room. I'm also an instructor in the School of Business and Media at BCIT, the British Columbia Institute of Technology, and I spend a lot of my time working with students around marketing, and of course continue to find ways to incorporate reconciliation into the work that I am doing with my students. So I'm very honored to be here to facilitate this session today. Word Vancouver is a festival that has existed since the 1990s. I can't remember the year it started, but I think this is my maybe 25th time being here at the festival. And it's just so fun to come together with authors and readers and people who love books and academics and business owners in the book field all together to celebrate and honor what we do. I would like to, and I've been asked to do a few housekeeping notes here, so I wanted to invite you all to consider supporting the festival online by becoming a member or through the silent auction that's going on right now, and you can find that information at wordvancouver.ca. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. First, a special thank you to Connects UBC, the UBC Library, and UBC Robson Square, where we are today, for their sponsorship, which made this space available to us. We'd also like to thank our generous festival sponsors and donors. This includes the Canada Arts Council, Canadian Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, the DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Quill, Pace and Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, of which I'm a member, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada, also a member. For a full list of all the festival's partners, please visit the website. Again, that's wordvancouver.ca. Without this support, this free festival would not happen. And we are very grateful for everyone who makes a contribution in whatever way that they're able to do so. It is now my privilege to introduce our guest of honor this afternoon, the most wonderful Alison Tedford Seaweed. She is an author and a business consultant from Abbotsford. Her career has centered around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social impact, and creating that social impact. She's a member of the Kwakutl First Nation and a woman, a mom, a person living with disability, and also she has brought incredible professional practice to her work, first working 10 years with the federal government on Indigenous inclusion issues with the Canadian government, and over the last 6 years she has been a full-time entrepreneur, including writing 3 books, most recently this one, The Canadian Business Guide to Reconciliation, Best Practices for Indigenous Inclusion, which very much ties into our theme today in this conversation. So Alison and I had discussed just maybe doing a little icebreaker activity, and I'm going to ask 3 questions to those in the room, and those of you online can raise your hand if you are able or feel like participating, but we're just curious, who in the room has heard of Orange Shirt Day? 100%. Excellent. And have you heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Show of hands, everybody in the room. And finally, have you had an opportunity to read, either in full or in part, the calls to action that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Many of us have. Wonderful. So that just gives us a sense of understanding who's in the room and what's happening. So I'm going to start by asking you this, Alison, and I'll do a lot less talking moving forward. Would you please maybe tell us, why did you write this particular book?
After the confirmations of the grave sites into Kamloops, because I've shared a lot online about my own ancestry and my culture and my family, and very active in circles with entrepreneurs, I had a lot of people reaching out to me asking me, like, is this something I should be involved with? Is it okay for me to talk about this? What should I say? What can I do? There was just a lot of like support, but not a lot of like knowledge around what could be done with it, and really how best to approach things. And so I thought it would be good to have a resource for people to be able to draw from. So I can do things that are not answering Instagram messages, and um, hopefully people can take it at their own pace and learn some things that they can implement in their business, and find some ways to do what they'd like to do, in a good way that they can feel good about, that can actually make a difference for people.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, one of the resources that you write about early in this book is defining what reconciliation means from a variety of different perspectives. Maybe just so we have a common understanding here in this session, would you feel like talking about those perspectives?
For sure. I mean, from my perspective, I see reconciliation as a process of getting into right relationship and moving forward together in a good way. And so that's really, it's around making things right after genocide, essentially, as much as reconciliation action planning and increasing Indigenous hiring can sometimes fall under the diversity, equity, and inclusion umbrella. And there's been a lot of literature around the benefits to organizations who are diverse, in terms of integrating various perspectives and being better able to reach different communities. But respectfully, like, reconciliation isn't about making people's businesses better, while that might be something that is a byproduct, but it really is about taking responsibility and participating and doing the right thing after genocide. So, and that's why in the book I don't really explore the impacts on a business of taking these actions, because it's more around moral responsibility, and also participating in what's happening right now within the business community, of finding ways to do the right thing. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of reconciliation. But there are so many different perspectives from so many different people, and I was very fortunate. I mean, as much as I wrote the book, I interviewed a lot of different people, academics, business owners, all sorts of people, to get their perspectives. So it does contain a number of different perspectives and definitions around reconciliation. And the reality is that, even amongst Indigenous people, sometimes there can be a dose of cynicism, or concern around whether focus on reconciliation is something that is a focus on a deficit, versus approaching things from a strength-based lens. So, those are perspectives that I like to try and hold as well. And I think that it's important to be mindful of all sorts of different perspectives on things. And part of being in relationship isn't just in terms of the contribution to the business community. It's our interpersonal relationships, and being mindful that, every person that you meet, every person you build a relationship with, is going to have a different perspective on it.
Of course, of course. I like that phrase you used right at the beginning, to right relationships, and that is such a big umbrella, and it's such a big job to do. I imagine some of the people in the room or watching online are business owners, or maybe team members in businesses that want to do right by reconciliation. Can you maybe make some suggestions about the kinds of actions? What's that first step that a business should consider when they want to honor reconciliation and do it in a meaningful way?
I think what I see is that a lot of people jump right to recruitment, and we obviously need to hire a lot more Indigenous people. And absolutely hire Indigenous people. Indigenous people are brilliant and bring excellence, and will definitely be a benefit to your business. However, I try to think about it like a dinner party, in terms of if you're going to invite people in, you want to make sure things are ready. You've got enough chairs, you have enough cutlery, you've got enough plates, everyone's going to be comfortable. And, you have what people need, and you have an understanding of what people need. You might ask if they have allergies or dietary restrictions, and, really taking that time to understand what's needed to have a successful event and a successful relationship. And in the same way, I encourage businesses to prepare themselves to begin that recruitment process, so that when you bring more people in, that you're not bringing people into situations that are going to be harmful because your staff haven't been provided with cultural competency training, because your policies don't meet their needs, like they haven't been structured in a way that recognizes that, the lives of family cultural experiences may be very different. And so I encourage people to look in before looking out, or at least while looking out, to make sure that they're ready to receive all of the excellent talent that they're going to recruit, and so that people are more likely to not just be recruited but also retained. So the reality is that, in recruiting community members, they're going to bring back their experiences to their families, their friends, their communities. And when you have a situation where you've recruited people into somewhere that isn't quite ready and they may not have had the most positive experience, that's the impression that your business is going to be making on their communities. And that could be a barrier to work that you want to do in community if the majority of their members haven't had a good experience. So I always recommend that folks look at how they can do that in a good way. Even the recruitment process, doing the same thing you've always done might, end up with the same results. And if you haven't historically recruited a lot of Indigenous talent, there might be barriers in your hiring processes that you're not even aware of. So taking the time to look at the needs allows you to not only create an environment people will want to work, not just a company people will want to get hired by, but also it will actually let you do that recruitment, because you're thinking about those needs as part of the recruitment process and not just responding to things as people are realizing that the policies don't quite fit and that things aren't going the way that they would like them to go. So it's good to look inward before you look outward, but definitely always encourage recruitment. Just be mindful of it so that it can be a good experience for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask you just to sidebar a little bit, to talk a little bit more about those barriers to hiring? What does that look like for an employer if they're posting their job? What can they do differently?
One of the things that I see is sometimes we put in a way of measuring things that we've always used, but maybe there's other ways to look at things. If you have a degree requirement that isn't actually regulatory relating to the position, like you're looking for depth and breadth of experience. You're looking for somebody who can pick something, commit to it, and see it through. There's so many different ways to measure that are not something that, and I know I say this at UBC, so I hope I don't get struck by lightning, but there are other ways. And to be fair, I'm also a grad student and a TA. So I have, the utmost respect for academia, but degrees are not the only way that someone can demonstrate commitment to seeing something through. They're not the only way that you can gain a depth and breadth of experience. And that's not to say that Indigenous people are not educated, but that there are barriers to education that can exist. And in opening up those spaces, you won't even just find that you'll get more Indigenous applicants, but you'll be able to incorporate all sorts of different people. This is really about being, responsive to what it is that you're looking for and what are the ways that you do it. And if you're generally just posting things on a job board, but you're not actually intentional about going and, promoting a position somewhere where Indigenous people are likely to be, hanging out and reading specifically. Like if you really want to hire Indigenous people, like go talk to people at the Friendship Center, go talk to Indigenous services at local universities. Look for industry associations within your industry that are specific to Indigenous professionals. Look at Indigenous publications and see if you can run an ad. There's lots of different things where, just doing the same old thing that you've done to hire anybody before, which hasn't resulted necessarily in recruiting Indigenous talent, is, possibly going to have the same result. I also, encourage people to think about if you're running a recruitment process and an Indigenous candidate has, maybe cultural or ceremonial needs. If those are things that you would accommodate over the course of your employment, why wouldn't you accommodate that in the recruitment process? That's the kind of impression that you're going to give somebody if they're like, well, they wouldn't let me do this important thing while they were trying to hire me. Why would I believe they will do that once I'm an employee? So being mindful that there's flexibility, and also looking at, maybe transportation challenges. Sometimes we host events, interviews, places that are maybe not where people are going to be working. Maybe the place they're working is transit accessible, but the place we're hosting the interviews isn't. Or maybe the timing is going to be outside of when someone might have childcare. And would you like to hire somebody who, or would you want to exclude somebody who, maybe doesn't have funds for childcare because they don't have a job, but would be a good employee? Like, there's some room for flexibility there. Maybe maybe it's a kid-friendly interview. Maybe it's a virtual interview with an understanding that, somebody might be playing with a truck in the background. Maybe it's a phone interview. It's really just being open about, we've always done it this way, but why? And does it have to be that way? And as soon as we start to examine the things that have been kind of part of our recruitment processes for some unknown reason, because we've seen somebody else do that and that's how we were hired, then we have more space to be able to deal with barriers that might come up. And also, the other piece that I always get people to look at is, like, we think about who we refer to opportunities, who we invite into things. They tend to be people in our circles, or people that somebody who knows somebody we know through our social connections. So if you're not hanging out places where there's other Indigenous people, if you don't have Indigenous friends, you're not going to events, like, maybe that's a place that you want to start, is to start building those relationships, so that when somebody asks you, do you know an Indigenous architect, you can be like, well, yeah, like, it's Bill, right? We have coffee sometimes, right? And so that's the other piece, is that having those social connections can help you get more people to hear about your opportunities, and more of the kinds of people that you're looking for.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, we've talked quite a lot about recruitment and hiring and the culture of the organization. But there are, of course, many organizations that are small operations, maybe only one or two people, or operations that have very little, if any, turnover in staff. So recruitment is not an area where Indigenous inclusion could be part of the approach to reconciliation. Could you suggest some other steps that businesses might be able to incorporate in those scenarios?
Oh, for sure. I always encourage people to look at procurement. So where are you getting the things that your business needs? If you regularly host meetings, who's catering them? And where are you hosting them? Can you be renting space from an Indigenous organization or community if they have boardroom space that they rent out? Could you be hiring an Indigenous caterer? If you send out gifts at Christmas to your clients, are there gifts that you could be purchasing from Indigenous businesses? Looking at who you contract to provide services, and whether there's room for supplier diversity there, and really looking at who's available, because it could be that when you establish your business that there wasn't good visibility as to which Indigenous businesses were operating in the space, but it might be a little easier now, or new people might have entered the space. So really taking the time to look at who can you connect with, contract with. Like, thinking about a hotel, you've got in-room amenities. So who are your Indigenous soap makers, your shampoo makers, the decor, the things that you're selling in your gift shop, so you don't have to, like, reinvent the wheel and create new business lines in order to integrate things, but really look at what are you already doing and how can that be more inclusive. And then otherwise, looking at, if you have corporate giving, what are some ways that you could maybe include donating to Indigenous charities? If your staff are volunteering and you're supporting those efforts, can you be encouraging staff to be volunteering at charities that are Indigenous? Or looking at kind of joint partnerships and joint ventures. Like, can you be working with local communities to serve your clients? So maybe you're at your hotel, you're working with local communities who provide guides or who provide events that you can refer people to. Or how can you make your business one that refers people to Indigenous businesses? When they come and ask, where should I have dinner? Which whale watching tour should I take? Having a list of places that you can refer people can make a big difference as well. Even if you can't personally hire people, you can send people other places.
Mm-hmm. Are there opportunities for business owners to get involved with advocacy at all?
I think if advocacy is something that you're comfortable doing in terms of sharing your values with your employees, as business owners, I think if we're talking about, well, I'm really wanting to be committed to reconciliation in my business, on a personal level, you might consider well, how are you voting? Who are the people that you're helping elect contributing to reconciliation? Are they helpful to Indigenous people or harmful? And I'm not going to state who falls into which camp or anything. That's a personal judgment. But really just reflecting on, if this is something that you're going to want to do, how are you living that in other areas? How are you, raising awareness possibly of issues in Indigenous communities? How are you acknowledging? Really, I hear people saying, oh, I don't want to get political in speaking about this event or that event, but really you're demonstrating situational awareness. It's really surreal to be working in a workplace that's not acknowledging something that's significantly impacting you, right? And it can feel like people don't care, and it can be awkward to be like, is it okay to talk about? So when you lead and say, we acknowledge that many of our First Nations neighbors were, evacuated due to the fire, and thank goodness the First Nations Emergency Services Society has been providing support. This is what they do. If you're looking for places to donate to wildfire relief, then this is one option that could be helpful to our neighbors. And really just contextualizing current events and explaining, how people are impacted, because there can be a disproportionate impact in terms of the extent to which people are able to respond to disasters, to emergencies, to things that are happening. And just because something isn't a barrier, to your staff, because hopefully you're compensating them well and they have all of the benefits that they need and they have lots of support and EAP and all of those things, thinking about community members who may not have those things, it's good to be able to raise awareness that, while some things might feel like an inconvenience, it can be disproportionately felt in community, and to just be able to educate that, even just getting online and having access to broadband, that's a significant disparity. And so I encourage business owners to share their values and what they do. It helps your employees know who you are, and it allows them to participate in a way that they would like to, whatever that looks like. And I just think it's part of showing leadership is guiding staff along the things that they would like to do.
Mm-hmm. Alison and I have known each other for many years, and one of the things we've often discussed is opportunities for professional development. We're both in academic settings in addition to being authors. When it comes to Indigenous inclusion, reconciliation, we know that businesses have budgets for professional development, whether they're spending that on first aid lessons or something else. If they were looking at spending some of those dollars, or maybe all of those dollars in a given year on professional development, what would you suggest as what sorts of things they might look at for that instruction?
There's lots of organizations that provide cultural competency training. So it's good to look at who are facilitators in your area. The Canadian Council of Aboriginal Businesses has a listing of folks who do work like this, and also really investing your staff time. There's some really great free options that might just take your staff time to work through. Ravens Trust has Home on Native Land, which is a really good online course, and it's actually funny. It's led by a comedian, And so like normally you don't think you'll laugh about colonization. Usually I cry about it, but you can do both. and that's a really great benefit. So that's one option. There's the Four Seasons of Reconciliation. There's the University of Alberta course. There's a lot of different information that's available that staff might just need some dedicated time to work through, because we always have the best of intentions. But having some time that's specifically dedicated to learning more can always be helpful. And then, beyond that, just looking at who are Indigenous service providers who maybe are providing your first aid training. Like that's another area of supplier diversity. Like you don't just have to hire Indigenous people to talk about sad things that happened. Indigenous people have many marketable skills that do not just include discussion of things that we wish didn't happen or weren't happening, but also, maybe able to provide the training that your staff need in other areas. So looking for supplier diversity there can be also really helpful.
Awesome. One of the things that really struck me when I read your book, and I reread it recently with this session in mind, is you coined a phrase that I hadn't heard before, and it was the concept of heart work. Would you mind defining that and maybe talking to us a little bit about what heart work means in your work?
Yeah. I talk about the homework and the heart work in terms of, we do our homework in terms of reading and learning, and our heart work is how we are in relationship and how we're relating to each other and what kinds of things that we're thinking about as we're doing this work together, and how we can, demonstrate respect for each other and how to prepare ourselves for the things that we're going to do. If we're going to be welcoming somebody in, how are we making sure that they know what to expect? How are we making sure that, our staff know what the parameters are? How are we, thinking about what they're going to need and making sure that we're addressing it. And also remembering that, a great way to show allyship is, hiring people that do these kinds of conversations October through May also, and July through September, because June and September can be very heavy months, and these are topics that always matter. The June and September are the times where these things are most often discussed in terms of Indigenous Peoples History Month and Truth and Reconciliation Day. But a lot of the people that you hire will have been asked to do a very great number of these discussions, and that can be really emotionally draining, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot to do. And so when you take the time to share about that at other times of year, it also helps from a sustainability perspective for businesses. But also, it also shows that in terms of your staff, that this is something that's year round. It's not something just that we remember a couple of times of year when the content calendar says we should talk about it. But we're impacted by these intergenerational factors every day of the year. And there's always an opportunity to discuss it. So I encourage people to make it a year-long journey in learning, and really to spend time to think about, the personal relationships and how we take care of each other as we do this work, and how we, consider the needs of everybody that we're inviting to the table.
Mm-hmm. I certainly can appreciate that notion of the heavy work being overloaded in June and September, given dates that we celebrate as a country, honor, that the word's not right there. Sometimes I've observed that individuals will automatically go to an Indigenous person for an Indigenous issue related answer. Is that always necessary?
Well, I always encourage people to Google. Please Google. But should you find yourself in a position where that's not possible, or in recognition of the fact that many of our stories are oral and have been passed down and are not even accessible to us as people if we are outside of our home communities, Identifying, is the Indigenous person I am going to ask this question, is this their job? Is it their job to educate me? Oh no, Bill runs the forklift. It is not his job to teach me about colonization. So don't ask Bill, the forklift driver, to explain it to you. Or if you're going to, ask him, I'd like to ask you about X, Y, or Z. Is that okay? And he can say, oh, tomorrow would be a better day to talk about that. I'm too tired to talk about that today, but I'll talk to you about it tomorrow. Or, no, not talking about that. But I think that if you talk to our friends in learning and development, they'll be able to direct you to somebody who can. It is challenging when Indigenous people in the workplace end up becoming kind of the information source to educate all of their colleagues about Indigenous people without that being compensated, right? If that's not their job to answer those questions, then it's a bit, it can be tricky, and it shouldn't be a burden that's placed on them just because they thought it was a good idea to come and work for your company. And you know, just as much as you probably wouldn't appreciate having to educate people about all of the difficult things that, you know, your own people might have encountered, right? It shouldn't be an expectation that just because you are from this community that it is your job to educate all of the people in your workplace. So if, you know, Bill's job is to educate people, he's the Indigenous relations person, definitely ask him because he's the person who knows. But if he just runs a forklift and he's not into it, don't bother him about it. Google and ask somebody whose job it is. And if you're the person running the organization, then identifying who is the person to answer that, so that all of your new recruits are not becoming the Indigenous Relations Department because they work there.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that with us. Part of our session today is to give our audience, both here in the room and online, an opportunity to ask questions. Yanis, if you've got a comment section where you can potentially, if we have any questions online, we'll just put that out there if anyone who's watching would like to. Are there any questions here in the room at this time?
My son is here, and if he wants to know what's for dinner, I don't know.
Yes, please state your question and I'll repeat it so the microphone will pick it up.
I was just going to say that there a lot of businesses don't want to engage in decolonization because there's no incentive to do so. But do you think that there is an incentive for getting a reputation as being a business that does things in a really good way, especially in a city like Vancouver?
So the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase, that I've lost it. I'm sorry. So there are sometimes businesses aren't necessarily incentivized to acknowledge reconciliation or Indigenous inclusion in their work. And if they're not incentivized, how, please repeat your question.
Getting a reputation for doing business in a decolonial way and in a good way, actually an incentive on its own.
Is
in a city like Vancouver, where there's a lot of native-run businesses.
Thank you for repeating that. So is there an advantage or an incentive for businesses to do business in an inclusive way, as we've been talking about, especially in a city like Vancouver?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's important to be known for, you know, what you believe in and doing what you believe in. I think that if you have shared, if you have a commitment to reconciliation, doing something about it, and being clear about what that looks like in your business is important. It also helps, you know, establish credibility. If you say something matters to you, this is what you do about it, and this is what it looks like. And then if somebody says, "Hey, I thought you cared about that thing," you know, I don't think you do because this is what you did. You can contextualize and say, I care about this thing. This is why I do X, Y, and Z to show that I care about this thing. And, you know, understanding where you're coming from in terms of this is what you think that it looks like. This is how we're expressing it within our organization, and being able to provide concrete examples so that it isn't just nice words that you hired somebody to write for you, but actually an expression of those values in the way that you're working. I mean, it's something that can be helpful in terms of your recruitment process, not just in terms of recruiting Indigenous people, but, you know, in terms of recruiting allies who would like to work for an organization that actually shares their values. And, you know, something else that, you know, think that we don't always think about as much in terms of like UNDRIP is something that is often we think about, the need for free, prior, and informed consent around resources. But it's something that's also really contextual to storytelling. And when we think about, content marketing and how sometimes many of our marketing content might talk about maybe work that we're doing in communities, those stories like that's extractive also, and we need to be mindful of how we share those stories of impact. And so I think that's another way that it's important to be thoughtful of your reconciliation goals when you're sharing stories of how you've contributed to communities, because the way you share those stories, the way you share about your partners, that impacts the relationship, right? And so if you care about protecting those relationships, then the way you share the story of impact really matters, because it shows how you feel, right? Is it a rescue mission, or is it a cool story about something you did together? Right. And so that has some implications in terms of power. It has implications in terms of how capable you feel the community is. And it also recognizes the strength and resources that they're bringing to their own story of fixing something. And also it's important, if you are a community that's going to be giving back within Indigenous communities, being mindful of the principle of like nothing about us without us, and having those conversations so that you're not fixing a problem that doesn't exist, or imposing your own values on a community around how things happen. That means that, the way things are happening in community maybe doesn't look the way you would expect, but it's perfectly functional for everybody involved. And I think that's just part of having a good relationship, right? It's not wandering and telling people they're doing it wrong. And I'm having that perspective can be helpful in terms of your relationship with community, because you're not imposing those judgments.
I wonder, Alison, if, and I'll talk for a moment to give you a chance to think about it, if there's a case study that you might share with us. Either you could name the brand, or maybe just name generally it's a bakery or a coffee shop or a bank or whatever. Is there a case study that you might share with us, maybe not in full, but just sort of sharing with us something that's like really concrete, applying what we've been talking about so far this afternoon?
Something that I've seen was that TELUS has implemented some really interesting employment policies around time for ceremony and wellness. So I think if you take some time to look on LinkedIn, they've done a lot of sharing around how they've changed their employment policies to be more inclusive of Indigenous people. They're somebody that I usually point to in terms of having made some concrete steps. And they also, they do a lot of giving within community as well, which is really helpful. But definitely in terms of employment policy, they're showing a lot of good leadership there lately.
Great, thank you. It's nice to have something concrete to consider. Were there any other questions in the room or online that we might want to address at this time? Well, Alison, brings me to my final question for the afternoon. And it is quite an open-ended question to allow us to see what parts of your mind we have not yet visited. We've covered so much, but I imagine my questions have not fully given you opportunity to share all of your thoughts. And I just wondered if there was anything that we haven't touched on that you might want to share with this wonderful group of people, both here and online.
I think what I like to tell people is that, Call to Action 92 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which speaks to how corporate Canada can participate in reconciliation, identifies creating opportunities in terms of hiring and all of those things that businesses should be doing, in response to genocide. Beyond that, when you bring in Indigenous talent, you're not doing a favor to Indigenous people. You're able to benefit from great people who have great skills, who maybe have different experiences or professional paths, or maybe not. Maybe they've done all of the things that your existing employees have done, but they just haven't thought to work for you before. But I really encourage people that it is of benefit to bring in perspectives, new perspectives, that there's a lot of excellence within our community. There's a lot of brilliance, and it's not just creating an opportunity for Indigenous people, it's creating opportunity for you too to get to work with awesome people. And in those employment relationships, our personal relationships develop, and that's an opportunity to get to know people who have different life experiences, and to be able to expand your social circle and get to enjoy, being part of maybe their community by extension. I always joke that you might also get a bannock recipe, but not if you're going to be my friend, because I use a mix and I am terrible at making bannock, so don't ask me. But so that's what I like to tell people, is that there's a lot of Indigenous excellence, and it is it's great to create opportunities, but it's really great for you too to get to bring in Indigenous employees and staff members, students, and so I encourage people to look at it from a perspective of it's a benefit to the company, and it's doing the right thing. So
That's a lovely final message. In fact, those kind of introductions is how Alison and I got acquainted. My book publicist sent her media journalist hat a copy of one of my books, which made us get introduced. We became friends, and we have since worked with the same editor at the same publishing company. So there's a nice synergy and a lovely friendship that has resulted. So thank you, Alison. Just to wrap up our time here together, and I think we'll have a few minutes just to mingle afterwards if anyone wants to say something or maybe feeling shy about sharing with the group. First of all, I wanted to invite anyone who is interested in talking further with Alison on a professional level. She offers a variety of services, and you can connect with her by requesting a call. It's a Zoom call, I assume.
it's phone call.
A phone call, old school phone call. But if you go to AlisonTedford.com, you'll find a button right there on the homepage to do that, or reach out to her on LinkedIn, Alison Tedford Seaweed on LinkedIn, I believe. Thank you very much, Alison, for sharing your work today. It's such a joy to collaborate with you and to have an opportunity to highlight all the important work that you're doing. And I feel very privileged to have had that chance. So thank you for sharing your experience. Once again, if anyone is interested, they are invited to support the festival as well at wordvancouver.com. And if you'd like a copy of the Canadian Business Guide to Reconciliation, 32 books is on site. And if they don't have any copies left at this time, they can definitely order one for you. And I imagine Alison has a book signing pen if you want to pop by and have her sign it as well. Thank you to all the staff and all the sponsors and donors and all of you for being part of this Word Vancouver event today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you again, Alison.
Thank you.